need to hone, and it is Friday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. I ran a poll last week letting you all determine what the topic of this week's worst video would be, and legendary creatures beat enchantments in a landslide. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the 10 most awful legendary creatures. Sort of. See, if I actually did that, I would spend a long time talking about creatures from just a few sets. Homelands, Portal 3 Kingdoms, Kamigawa Block, and of course, Legends. Instead of only discussing terrible legends from those few sets filled with terrible legends, I chose to only talk about the very worst of them in each of those sets. They're sort of a representative of each of those sets on this list. That way we can talk about a more diverse group of bad legendary creatures. This means those sets only take up 4 spots on the list instead of 10, which is what would have happened. To make this list, these cards had to do, or I guess not do, 3 things. They had to not see play at all in Constructed, not be good in their respective limited format, and not see much play in EDH, either as a commander or as a card that's just in the deck of an EDH deck. I find looking at EDH to be a good way to find the worst cards, since EDH is such a wide open format that even cards with very narrow usage that would be bad in Constructed or in Limited can find a home. Even the cards on this list have seen a little bit of play there, but they probably shouldn't be. All of the stats about EDH decks I'm going to show are from the EDH Rec. Now, let's get started. At number 10, we have a card that is actually a representation of Urza, one of the game's original and most powerful planeswalkers, Blind Seer. This was one of Urza's disguises, and he did a really good job of disguising himself because this card's terrible and he's incredibly powerful. To be fair, the design of the card is actually pretty cool. Changing the colors of spells or permanents could be interesting. You could use it to make it so that spells that are meant to color hose can always target your opponent's stuff and things like that. Imagine making a permanent red and then casting Blue Elemental Blast on it, for example. Problem is, there just isn't enough of that out there in blue for that to matter. And wouldn't you rather just play, like, I don't know, good removal spells and a more powerful commander? And a 4-mana 3/3 with this lackluster ability isn't going to accomplish much. There are some people who clearly like the challenge of making a Blind Seer deck, since there are 88 decks featuring him as the commander in EDH Rec, but I think a large portion of his popularity is the fact that you can say, yeah, my commander is Urza. There's not really another card that lets you say that. At number 9, we have another blue legend, Taniwha. While a very efficient creature as a 5-mana 7/7 with Trample, Taniwha comes with insane downside that makes it all but unplayable, and that is the phasing mechanic. If you don't know what phasing does, and if you don't, who could blame you, at the beginning of your untap step, all permanents you control with phasing phase out, and that means they don't actually exist on the board anymore. If on your upkeep you have a creature with phasing who is already phased out, they phase in and exist on the board again. They get to keep any auras attached to them, counters, and so on, and they're not going to have summoning sickness when they come back. It isn't like leaving play. It's a whole different zone that is different than exile. So with Taniwha, the first turn after you play it, it will phase out. The next turn, it will phase in, and that sounds good, right? But not so much. It already has the downside of phasing out, you know, when you'd rather just be attacking with it every turn. But once he's around, he also makes all of your lands phase out. So you better be playing a bunch of instants so that you can use that mana before they disappear, or maybe a bunch of mana rocks, because at that point, you can't use your mana. Yeah, phasing is kind of a dumb mechanic. It has since been replaced by flicker effects, and we can all be thankful for that. All of that makes Taniwha pretty bad. It's on the board half the time and AWOL the other half, and on the turns where it is phased in, you don't have any lands. Great. One of the best signs of being a bad card is that you see a lot of play in Zedru the Great-Hearted, a deck that likes to give permanents with awful downsides to the opponent, and that's pretty much the only place where this sees play within EDH deck. At number 8, we have Mer Axis from Keld. A 6-mana creature. He can be pretty huge, sort of. He has power and toughness equal to the number of untapped artifacts, creatures, and lands you control, which sounds kind of cool when you first look at it. I mean, he can be so huge, right? But having to keep all your stuff untapped is kind of hard in Magic, since tapping your lands helps you cast more spells, and tapping other permanents is necessary for many an activated ability. You can end up getting blown out too if you attack with him and your opponent blows up a permanent or two at instant speed, and suddenly he shrinks so that they can just block him. He doesn't even have any kind of evasion, and when he has to tap to attack, he actually shrinks himself. That's all pretty bad, and that's why hardly anyone plays him in EDH. At number 7, we return to another blue legend. In this case, it's Hakeem Loreweaver. A 5-mana 2/4 flyer isn't great, but look at that text box. He's got to do something good, right? He can take enchantments out of your graveyard and attach them to himself. That's kind of cool. It would be if he were maybe white or green. As it stands, blue doesn't have very many useful enchantments, so he isn't much of a commander. Sure, I get it, you can do some silly things with Eldrazi Conscription, but beyond that, he just doesn't work well for his color. As a result, he wasn't good in his own time, and he isn't good in EDH. Some people have taken up the challenge of building EDH decks around him, and surprise, surprise, most of them focus on the Eldrazi Conscription thing. Needing to get that specific card into your graveyard, and then hoping your Hakeem gets it out of your graveyard without dying, and not doing any of it very quickly, doesn't seem very good to me, and that's why people don't play him for the most part. At number 6, we have our representative for Kamigawa block, Shimatsu the Blood-Cloaked. There are lots of legends in Kamigawa block, think like in Dominaria, and there were a ton of bad ones. Shimatsu the Blood-Cloaked is the worst of the worst. For 4 mana, you get a 0/0 who only gets counters if you sacrifice permanents when you cast him, so you can like give up your whole board and get like a 7/7. I know that in some situations it will be bigger, but man, 4 mana for this guy is sort of insane. To come out ahead or have a creature with decent stats, you have to sacrifice 4 permanents in addition to casting him. Imagine a 4 mana 4/4 that made you do that, and that's basically what Shimatsu is. He's just terrible. EDH-wise, part of his problem is that red just doesn't have that many sacrifice synergies. It isn't like he's black or green, which would maybe lead to him seeing some play, so there isn't a ton you can do with him there. There are 26 decks in EDH rec running him as the commander for some reason, but, you know, that's not that many in the grand scheme of things. Steer clear of ever playing Shimatsu in any format whatsoever, and you'll be better off for it. At number 5, we have Mandor Greven Ilvek. For 6 mana, he gives you a 7/5 with Fear. That's not too bad, but he also makes you sacrifice a creature. That isn't completely horrendous, but for the mana you pay and the downside he makes you have, he's not really worth it. Not even in his own time. He needed to cost less mana or come with a slightly bigger body, maybe like an 8/6 or something, and then maybe people would be interested. As it stands, he isn't really played anywhere in EDH. Part of this is that he's kind of boring. Like, what are you going to do with him if you build around him? But people aren't playing him in sacrifice-heavy decks either. He's only a card in 39 decks in the entire, and all of EDH rec, you know, and is a commander in 11. So, yeah, he's really not seeing much play. At number 4, we have 2 cards, both from Weatherlight, who are sort of part of a mini cycle or something, and those are Gala Braids and Morinfin. Both of these creatures were, at the time, pretty efficient for their cost. Both were 5 mana, 5 power creatures with a keyword ability and a downside. Both came with cumulative upkeep, pay 1 life. If you don't know what cumulative upkeep is, and again, who could blame you, it's a horrible mechanic that we are never going to see again, it meant that every upkeep you paid a cost and added a counter to the permanent. On subsequent upkeeps, you paid the cost for as many counters as there were on the permanent. So these guys would take 1 life, and then 2, and then 3, and as the game went on. Sure, creatures were worse at the time, but these guys paled in comparison to a card like Juzanjin, a 4 mana 5/5 who only did 1 every upkeep. He didn't have cumulative upkeep, he just did 1 every upkeep. The other kind of weird thing here for me is like, why are these legendaries? I can say what I will about the other cards on this list being bad, but they at least feel legendary. These just happen to feel like 2 black creatures who happen to be legends, and they're just bad. Morinfin is favored over Gala Braid in EDH. I guess flying is better than trample, but not by very much. Neither of these cards are really what you want to be doing in any format at all. At number 3, we have our representative from Homelands, Veldraine of Sangir. Like Kamigawa block, Homeland was loaded with horrible legends. While it came several sets after Legends, and more than a year later, it was sort of like they decided to go back to designing legendary creatures the way they were in Legends, which is to say that they were ridiculously underpowered, and Veldraine is a good example of that. You know, these days when we see a 7 mana 5/5, it better do something great, right? And, hey, you can give him Forest Walk. People playing Forest better look out. That 5/5 body is a real problem, but oh yeah, he also shrinks himself to a 2/5 to gain Forest Walk, in addition to costing 3 mana. Why? I mean, creatures were worse back then and all that, that's true, but cards like Shivan Dragon and Sarah Angel existed, and I'm not saying all cards at the time had to be that strong, but there were lots of reasonable creatures in existence back then. This guy is not one of them. For some reason, there are 3 EDH decks built around him on EDH Rec and 8 decks that run him. In most cases, most people are going for a very flavorful Sangir family deck, so that's lucky for Veldraine of Sangir because otherwise he probably wouldn't see play at all. At number 2, we have a representative from Portal 3 Kingdoms, Huangzhong Shu General. Portal 3 Kingdoms is a sort of weird set. It was printed specifically with the Asian market in mind, and its setting was based on Chinese history. The cards from the set are notoriously difficult to get your hands on because the print run was so small. It was a set loaded with characters that actually represented real people, and as a result, there were a lot of legendary creatures. Huang Zhang here was a real person, an incredibly successful military general who died around the year 220. It's a pity that they couldn't have given him a better card. There are a lot of mediocre legends in the set, but there are actually some that have gone on to be relevant in EDH. Huang Zhang is not one of them. A 4-mana 2/3 that can't be blocked by more than one creature is really bad. That text box may as well be empty, as it is really only going to be useful against very small creatures. As a result, not a single soul has built a deck around him in EDH Rec, and only 9 decks are running him at all. And at number 1, we have a representative from Legends, the set where the legendary type debuted, and a set filled with notoriously bad legends. This is the very worst in the set, though, and I would argue the worst legend ever, and that is Gosta Dirk. For the incredibly efficient cost of 7 mana, you get a 4/4 with First Strike. Oh, and you can turn off your opponent's Island Walk. This card is a real relic of Magic's past, where they were really obsessed with Land Walk, and turning it off was something that was put on a lot of cards for some reason. And like the vast majority of legends in the set, they made this guy cost an insane amount of mana. It's almost like they thought the gold cycle of legends should be less efficient than their monocolored counterparts, which is not what we see today. If you're expected to pay more than one color of mana for something, it's usually stronger than a monocolored card for the same cost would be. Not only does this guy cost 2 colors, he asks for 2 mana of each of those colors, and that's just insane. And yeah, there are lots of other horrible legends in the set, but all of them have actually seen more play in EDH decks than this guy. One particularly disturbed person has a deck with Gosta Dirk as a commander listed on EDH, but I'm hopeful they're just trolling us. That does it for this week's MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too, and subscribe for more Top 10s. I will be in and out of town the next couple of weeks. I have some family visiting me and stuff, and as a result, I'm recording the next 2 Top 10s ahead of time, which means there won't be polls for a couple of weeks, but I'll get back to doing polls for them when I can. Thanks for watching.